Welcome to the third installment of the Sharp Best Ball Show. I'm your host, Tod Burros, and you can find me on Twitter at Best Ball NFL. Remember, it's in the name, Best Ball. My guest today is Theo Gremminger from Player Profiler. Theo, what is your tag on Twitter?
You can find me at the OG Fantasy.
I normally have that handy, and I don't, so my apologies. And today we are going to go through some of the important takeaways, mostly about veterans, and we'll do some other stuff and just challenge each other. My article this week was about challenging your biases, and Theo is a big high stakes player, a player. There's not that many players that I respect. I hate to say it that way, but there's not that many that I feel are really good. There definitely are, but Theo is one of them. He is a true grinder, a true professional. He was on the Goat District podcast for a number of years. He's still doing the Goat District pod, as well as Player Profiler, as well as raising a family. And he is the man in this industry who most resembles Brock Lesnar.
I appreciate that as well. And I'll say, Todd, we're getting ready to square off in a big one shortly because we've got the Hardway draft that's coming up. Wherever the end of the month.
I think it's June 1st.
Well, yeah, June 1st.
And that is literally 10 killers. That's why it's called the Hardway.
Yeah, I can't wait to go up against you. It's like going a trip to the dentist, but that's one of the most memorable nights of the entire year. Dwayne McFarland's in that draft. Billy Muzio's in that draft. Dave Hubbard's in that draft. Austin Martin, Abib Agabatoba. That one's going to be a tough one, but I look forward to that.
I made it to the finals the first year, and I haven't gotten close in the next three. But I focused less and less on season long, and I'm knee deep in best ball, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, you ready to jump into your one season long draft for the next 3 months? And oh, by the way, it's against every good person you can think of in the industry.
And you're also in our Hardway Dynasty League, so we're drawing you into as many formats that are uncomfortable to you as possible, Todd.
Yes,
yes, we appreciate that.
And basically, I feel that I'm pretty good at those formats. Also, I just don't do them. I try and keep my focus because I'm old and I get tired easily. I try and keep my focus. I'm not a young gun like you anymore, Theo.
Yeah, it's tough, but I love bouncing between the formats. I love redraft. I love dynasty. I love best ball. And for me, I think I get sharpened in all three when I do all three. So maybe, the bandwidth thing will eventually catch up to me, Todd, but I love them all.
Last year, I actually had a really good season long. Both my main events made it. I cashed in both of those. They both made it to the playoffs. And I made the playoffs in 7 out of 10 in general of my leagues. So I did very well last year. I was a little more focused, and I cut down from like 20 to 7 or 8. And I had a partner. So it definitely helps, I think. I know you partner up as well.
Yeah, I partner up in the NFFC on a few teams with Nelson Sousa, who's a friend of ours and a great player. I partner up with Dan Williamson.
The #2 ranked fantasy player of all time behind Chad.
Nelson's a machine.
Well, at least in his own mind.
Well, he's very, very good. Again, like you, I don't want to heap praise on too many people, but I also split teams with Dan Williamson. I've split teams in best ball with you. I've split teams with Billy Muzio. Splitting teams is great. I like doing my own teams as much as possible, but I like also having some exposure to managers I respect, because I do think that improves your process. When I get a chance to speak to people like you and Billy Muzio about best ball, or Dan Williamson about best ball, it might open up my eyes to a player that I'm not considering. It might also make me question a guy that I'm overly bullish on. So I think that you, at least, even if you're not partnering with people, I think you need to have people you respect, no matter what level of fantasy football you're at, it helps when you have people that you can discuss it with and go through kind of, I know one of your questions, and I thought it was excellent, was about biases. But I think, when you
let me
discuss
get
things,
to that one.
Sorry to bury the lead. I don't want to bury the lead here.
I'm about to throw that one out at you. And by the way, our best ball teams did very well as far as pass through. And in the FFPC, pass through is really important because you get 300 for every 125 team. I think, if memory serves, out of the 7 teams we did, like 3 advanced and all of them finished in the top 4. We just didn't hit the luck in the playoff weeks. I remember we had a couple late injuries. That was the COVID year as well. So I do talk a lot about the importance of challenging your biases. I know from my past, not doing so can really hurt, as I missed out on Cooper Kupp 2 years ago. You started giving us your thoughts on biases, and I would like to know, other than challenging them like we're going to do today, do you have any other ways? Because I've mentioned this before, and if people listen to this pod throughout the year, they're going to hear me say it 100 times. The hardest part of fantasy football is to take in information and process it, really listen to it, but not be pushed around by things either. How do you handle that? And would you agree it's the hardest part of this whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, bias is such a interesting word because we grind so hard to try to identify ADP values and the players that we think can be the most advantageous for our builds. And we sometimes get to the point where we get a take lock, where we think that this guy is such an extreme value that there's no other way to go. Then you might end up with a best ball team where, best ball roster percentages, and you look down and you've taken, a great example was your Cooper Kupp, because in that exact same year, Cooper Kupp was going right next to his teammate, Robert Woods. If you would have simply, pivoted over every draft, and you might have liked this team situation and a lot, by simply pivoting between the two players, you would have given yourself a much better chance to win. In that same season, everybody was betting on Brandon Ayuk. Brandon Ayuk was the guy that year, and Deebo Samuel ends up winning people leagues. So oftentimes you might predict the situation correctly and not go with the correct player. I think last year, you had Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle. Both of those guys ended up hitting. They both hit. But at the end of the day, Jaylen Waddle might have been the better value because he was the one sliding down. Tyreek Hill, so I think that's a great example, Todd, that I think that the one thing that, you hear of certain players who do high volume best ball, and in an underdog type situation, I think this might have been a Justin Herzig thing where there was one competition he entered where the first 3 or 4 rounds he went on auto draft, and then he starts drafting once it gets to be round 4, because that way he had, exposure to as many players as possible without trying to, force himself upon it. So I wouldn't quite go that extreme, but I think you do need to be open to other concepts and open to the fact that you might not be right. So having too much exposure to a guy, even if you think he's a fantastic value, it can hurt you with injuries. It can hurt you with underperforming, and it can hurt you from NFL coaches just being, idiots and doing things that happens every year too.
Hence my 18 or 20% Kyle Pitts last year. So that's a great example. Another example is the one I wanted to talk about because I know you were on the player and I'm not. Let's see if one or the other of us can convince each other, because I remember you talking about Deontay Johnson, and it's not just who you take and take a lot of, it's who you fade. I know that, you say Deontay gets a lot of targets, and there's no argument about that, but he has more competition, and I'm not so sure that Pickett is going to improve much in year 2. And it seems that they've improved the offensive line, and, they've got 2 good running backs. Convince me why Deontay Johnson is a good pick in the 7th round.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head here. This is a guy that was going in like the 4th last year. Now he goes down to the 7th. And I think that the counter argument to that would be there's a reason that his ADP slid so much. And I will say that for Deontay Johnson, he's not a guy that I'm going to say I'm going to have like an overwhelming amount of exposure to. But I think when he presents himself in the 7th round, he's proven himself time and time again in terms of target share, in terms of number of targets. And last year, he was such an outlier in terms of touchdowns, where if he simply would have found the end zone a few times, I think that our outlook on him this year would have been different. And I actually think if he would have found the end zone like 4 times, not even a big ask, then I think he would be going at least a round ahead of where he's going. So, and you also bring up the target competition. I think oftentimes when we get into these situations, especially in best ball, where there's 3 guys that are attractive, where maybe they kind of all push each other down, pick a horse and bet on it. Because I think that at the end of the day, it's not going to be some even split between Pickens, Muth, and Deontay Johnson in terms of fantasy points scored. More likely than not, you have one big disappointer and you have one guy who does a lot better than expectations. And I would be willing to bet on the guy who we've seen it before, Mike Tomlin adores, and
they gave the big money to.
And they gave the big money to. So again, he's not a guy that you need to take every single draft, but I think the fact that it might be an overcorrection to touchdown scoring. And Todd, you'll be the first one to admit that touchdown scoring is one of the most difficult things to project.
Yeah, it can definitely be an advantage to slow down on the guys who were hyper efficient one year and to take, the discount on the guys who just didn't. But I'm going to read you a couple things. And again, this is the example that I want to use of how talented people can check their biases against each other. And you don't even need to say at the end, you've convinced me, you've not convinced me, because what you need to do is go back and think about what the other person said and make sure that you're still comfortable with your decision, because it's just as bad when someone talks you off someone you don't like and then they fail and you're like, oh, why did I let him talk me off him, as it is, to stick to your biases. So, I think I've done this form to kind of identify both floor and ceiling in best ball. And Deontay Johnson last year had a very reasonable, not great, but reasonable 50% of the weeks that he played, he gave you a usable score. I won't get into how I factor that, but 50% of the week. The people around him aren't great, but Thielen, Drake London, Brandon Cooks, Mike Evans, Zay Jones, and Deontay were all guys, right? But in the very important point above average, in other words, once you get that baseline score, how many points did he give you above that? He finished 70th among wide receivers with 1.5 points a game. To show you how the people around him, Allen Robinson, Noah Brown, Isaiah McKenzie, Romeo Doubs, Chris Moore, Tyquan Thornton. So I agree that, regression is there, and I also agree with your point about the team, right? Like if you believe in a team, you can pick a horse, you can take one in each draft. And the other thing you have to worry about is, what if one of those guys gets hurt, right? If Pickens gets hurt, well, Deontay Johnson has gotten a big bump and vice versa. But I did want to share that with you, Theo, and as an example of how we can challenge each other, your thoughts on that.
No, I think that's a great way of looking at it is, of course, the players around them. I just while you were talking, I looked at the underdog ADP. And Todd, I may like Jordan Addison and Jahan Dotson just as much if we're going by underdog in terms of right there with Deontay. So But I do think that the one takeaway that we both agree on is looking at teams. And, if I like a guy on a team, I should be willing to go with, be willing to be wrong, because we have seen this usually it's a situation where if one guy hits, it ends up being a big win. So, and I like your comment about the injury, because if Pickens goes down, or for that matter, I even think if Najee Harris goes down or Pat Freiermuth goes down, if simply one target getter goes down in that offense, everybody should expand their roles a little bit, and Deontay could end up being a double-digit target guy every single week.
Or if Pickens has a better year than I anticipate. You have to leave room for things to happen that you're not expecting. That's a big part of biases, right? My bias is that Pickens isn't going to be very good, right? But what if I'm wrong, right? So typically with guys, and that's why I mix my exposures up, and we'll get to that in a second. But that's where I believe in taking the discount. So if Deontay's in the late 6th, early 7th round, I might not have much, right? Because there's other players there that I do like more. But in the 8th round, that's when I try and get my exposure to guys that I don't like as much. And if you do volume, Theo, as you know, everyone drops occasionally. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at it. And Chad Schroeder has that same approach with redraft, where it might be a guy that you don't like in one round, but like everybody's got a price at a certain point. And I think in best ball, it makes a lot of sense, especially when you get to best ball later.
Can I throw in one other point there?
Yeah, absolutely.
And add in the fact that you and I both know, as good as we like to think we are, we're wrong a lot, right?
Yeah.
In every given year, I know that I'm going to be wrong. So even that's one way to fight your biases, is by forcing yourself to take someone at a discount, even though your instinct might be to avoid them completely, just in case you're wrong.
And Todd, you also bring up a great point about rounds, where the hit rates, a lot of times, when you go down into the 7th, 8th, 9th round, there's a certain player in those rounds where either that's a young player we're projecting to take a leap, or it's a veteran who's taken a knock from the year before. There's usually some sort of a flaw. And the deeper you go down, there's more and more flaws or more and more risk. So, getting kind of a take lock in a certain round, or being unwilling to take a guy in a certain round, I think that's just the wrong approach. There's guys who smash out of these rounds, but there's also a lot of guys who fail big time. So not only us failing, but I think just the general ADP range is a fail range.
Yeah, I love that, Theo. All right, so let's talk a little bit about timing. I think we all know that there's an advantage in waiting till start drafting. I know that Mike Leone kind of proved that. For best ball, it's even more important, because you're giving yourself more injuries to happen by waiting early. But the next 2 weeks, while ADP settles, to me, is one of the better times to draft during the year. When do you like to draft, Theo? And what are your thoughts about this window of 2 weeks while ADP settles?
I really do enjoy drafting in May and June. I think that I would say that it's a longer period of time than 2 weeks, because you'll see the initial wave of best ball, and then, like, as you know, Todd, the guys keep coming in, start drafting, then you see that wave of people that comes in around the 4th of July. And then if you keep going and going, you get to tourist season, as we like to call it.
I love tourist season.
Tourist season's great.
I love both the name, and that's a Dave Hubbard saying. And
hat tip to Dave Hubbard, who's one of the better players.
That might be my favorite Dave Hubbard line ever.
It's a great one, but it's true. So for me, like, again, I do a lot of dynasty as well, so it's difficult. Like this week, like, I know that a lot of the FFPC stuff is starting up, but for me, my focus is my rookie drafts. When I get through the rookie drafts, the focus completely goes to redraft and best ball. So I'll try to get in some best balls. Right now, I'll jump into a couple of slow ones. But in terms of sitting down and doing a live best ball draft, I just don't have the bandwidth this week. But I do think you have a great point. There's certain guys that the market hasn't adjusted completely, and you'll end up getting a huge win. Like I'll bring up, I think Jordan Addison is going to rise all summer long. He just gets drafted into a great situation, and I think his ADP will rise and rise and rise and rise. It might even end up getting to a point where it's too high. But like a guy like that, I think would be great. A number of these rookies, I think before like the dust settles, I think that they're going to be great values this time of year as well. And then you also have the high risk kind of guys where maybe there's an unsettled situation, maybe there's a trade rumor, maybe they're still out there as a free agent. There's less of those right now, but certainly like I think Leonard Fournette is interesting right now because I don't think he's going to be out of the league, and I think you can get him extremely late. And and I know the moment he signs with anyone, he's going to move up 5 rounds. And if he signs
especially if he comes in at his old weight, not last year's weight.
Well, we don't want to see fat Lenny would not be a good thing.
No,
We'd like to see
if we get a
Lenny.
chance at thinking it's playoff Lenny. He's 220 and he had to be 240 last year.
He looked big, but there was I feel like there's a lot of these running backs. You take a shot on now, and we might not see Leonard Fournette sign until someone gets injured, which is a real possibility. It happens every single year that some running back we like goes down, and then there's a huge scramble. So, it happened with Cam Akers years back. It happened with J.K. Dobbins years back. And then somebody fills in. So I think that you're spot on. This time of year, you can find some real values. And it's also betting on yourself versus betting on ADP, because you're basically looking at an unsettled situation. You have confidence in your abilities as a drafter and the ability to build an excellent team. And you can take advantage of that, Todd. Like an experienced drafter like yourself, you're able to do that. And then you get these other people who come in, and maybe it's easier to draft when you kind of have a map. It's easier to get one place when you know where you're going. Whereas nowadays it's like, I have confidence. I know I can crush it even though things are not settled. So I do think it's an interesting 2 weeks.
Yeah. I wrote an article last week on leveraging uncertainty in early best ball as it relates to first free agents, because we don't know where they land. Their ADP is down a couple rounds. Same thing happens with rookies, because we don't know the landing spots. Well, now it's these guys, and I did make a comment and specifically mentioned Leonard Fournette, because now it's the guys who haven't signed yet. So talk about embracing uncertainty and how important it is in fantasy.
I think embracing uncertainty is something that you have to do if you ever want to win really big in fantasy in general. I think that there's certain players who need to see it first before it can happen, and those sort of guys do not win big. They might have a very good season, but they can't win consistently. This applies to pretty much everything. It applies to best ball, it applies to redraft, and it applies to dynasty. You have to be willing to embrace the unknown and embrace the fact that people get displaced. They get displaced in terms of the pecking order of their teams, and young players break through, veterans get worse, and sometimes veterans find the perfect situation. So uncertainty is something that you need to embrace. I'm willing to be wrong when it gives me a chance to really dominate a league. Occasionally, uncertainty is going to jam you up. But at the end of the day, you're trying to win leagues, not finish in the middle. You're trying to win a lot of money and not, hey, maybe I want to, get into that pass line in best ball. You're trying to build behemoths. So embracing that uncertainty is a way to give yourself an advantage. It's just like Christian Watson. Like guys like this happen every single year in the NFL. And you can't walk into a situation, thinking that last year is going to repeat this year. Last year never repeats in the NFL. Like there's guys who did great in 2022 who who are going to do great in 2023. But then there's going to be guys that were great last year that are going to regress. There's guys that are great last year that are going to get injured. And there's young players who are going to take big steps up. It happens every single year. So uncertainty is something that very good players are embracing those situations, not running away from them.
Yeah. And I think going from a guy who dominated his local leagues to playing nationally like we do, that was the biggest thing that I was good enough just in picking players to be successful in, playing against buddies or in smaller leagues. When you get into these national contests where there's a ton of really talented people, I had to step up my uncertainty game. Let's move over to some of the ownerships that I have. And I want to give you a chance to kind of tell me if some of my heavy owned players you're not on and why. And ADP. So early, my top quarterbacks were Dak, Watson, Rodgers, and I also had a lot of Fields and Love. My thought process between Dak, Watson, and Rodgers is the top tier really got expensive. Guys went from the 4th round to the 2nd round, where those guys still are in the 7th to 10th round of drafts. But I think they give me the opportunity, they give me plausible deniability of a top 3 season. Are there any of those 5 guys you don't like? And what are your thoughts on that? You mentioned how the draft board changes every year. What are your thoughts on that strategy to adjust to what we've seen at the quarterback position?
I don't want to it's not like I'm coming on your pod and just trying to compliment you. I like the quarterbacks you're hitting. I especially like your Dak and Watson call. I think that Cleveland looks like a team by all of their actions that they're going to be looking to get more aggressive and put Watson in a position to succeed. I think last year was a very distracting year for him, to say the least. Everything's kind of cooled down with the off-field stuff. And I think that Cleveland adding Elijah Moore helps a lot. They added Cedric Tillman in the draft, which is also going to help. Amari Cooper, Donovan Peoples-Jones, David Njoku, and then they don't bring back Kareem Hunt, which makes me think that they're going to be a little more aggressive passing the ball, and they're devaluing RB2. So not to say Jerome Ford's a nothing guy, but he doesn't. They don't have the.
Let me jump in for a sec because it goes back to uncertainty. Watson played like crap last year, so the uncertainty in this case is that what if what we saw at the end of last year is who he is from now on? I think that's keeping his ADP down 2 rounds. That's why I like taking a shot on him and embracing that uncertainty.
Yeah, and I think it's also, not defending him as an off the field guy, but I think that there's certain people that just don't want to draft Deshaun Watson. And I think that that's like you talk about biases. We're not judging character, we're judging football talent. And the guy, last year people were rooting actively when he was failing. So now it's sort of like a piling on type thing, and we are here. But at the end of the day, there's a reason they gave him all that money. Did they overpay him? Was it a bad contract? Maybe. But I think that at the end of the day, we've seen Deshaun Watson succeed in almost every single season as a pro, except for one. Is he what he was last year, or is he closer to what he was 2 years ago? It remains to be seen. But by the actions Cleveland has shown you this offseason, I think if they really thought Deshaun Watson was regressing, the move would not be to put any effort into, receivers. It would be to get the defense as strong as possible and grind games out and bring in another running back.
Right.
So they obviously show they show a lot of confidence in Watson. The Moore trade, I think, was great value. Tillman offers another big, strong wide receiver. Donovan Peoples-Jones, Cooper. I mean, we have to like the weapons, and it's actually turning into a shootout division. By the actions Baltimore has shown you, Cincinnati being Cincinnati, it's a shootout division, so you have more chances for that as well. Dak is interesting because they did not bring back Schultz. They did not bring back Zeke Elliott. So to me, by adding Cooks and also talking up Gallup, There's a chance for more wide receiver targets, less tight end targets, more use of Pollard than Zeke also equals more targets, because Zeke is more of a traditional running back and Pollard's more of a two-way player. So I think that Dak, like Matt Kelly, who I do podcasts with, the player profiler, has brought up Dak as a dark horse MVP candidate this year, and I think that's an interesting take. So I do like him. Like I had some Dak last year in fantasy. It was tough with the injury early, but if you look at it through splits, he was very effective in the second half of the season when he came back from injury. So I like the way that offense is pointing up. The Rodgers one, I love Garrett Wilson. I really hope Breece Hall comes back strong. I like the idea of the Rodgers selection, and I actually have a couple of best ball builds where I took Rodgers because I thought he was a great value. But when I kind of poke holes in, is I do worry about the pace. It's LaFleur and Rodgers again. We saw when they were together in Green Bay how slow it was.
It was Hackett.
Oh, excuse me, Hackett. I'm misspeaking. Yeah, Hackett. Hackett in the Jets now with Rodgers. And I do worry a little bit about the pace because that defense is so strong, and they have the ability to run the ball, and they have the ability to take the air out of the football and win games like that. That's the one thing I would worry about. But in terms of, you have to love Garrett Wilson. I like the fact that they brought in Lazard for him. And Breece Hall gives him a receiver out of the backfield that is dynamic and talented. And the offensive line, they put a lot of work into having a sound O-line. So I get it, but I do worry about the pace and him being kind of a purgatory guy for you, even at that nice ADP. And then Fields.
I worry more about Dak than I do Rodgers. And I'll tell you why. Rodgers, in the 10th round, he played for a coach the last year that really slowed it down and really ran the ball. They didn't have I think it's going to be faster paced. And I think they unlike Green Bay, where he had to adapt to LaFleur, that was kind of the thing. I think the Jets have shown that they're willing to adapt to Rodgers to make him happy. So, but Dak, the thing that makes me worry about Dak is Mike McCarthy taking over for Kellen Moore. That's my one hesitancy with my Dak stuff.
Yeah, and Schottenheimer doesn't exactly make you thrilled either, but I don't know. I think it's, at the end of the day, you're having to beat Philadelphia, and you're going to have to eventually outscore them. And I think that Dallas kind of could be taking a step in the right direction. They had a very good draft, not like fantasy wise, but they were making sound decisions. I think they're heading in the right direction as an organization. And I don't know, you have to kind of take a leap of faith there. Again, you don't want to have take lock on what this coach did in the past every time, because, people change, the league changes. And I think chasing that behemoth in Philly might make that offense be a little more aggressive. So that's interesting. And then Fields,
I like that.
Fields is like, Justin Fields was fantastic last year. I love Justin Fields. I just feel like he might be getting drafted towards the high end of his outcomes. Like, he's pushed up to a point where he's very high up. The rushing ability insulates him from failing at all. Like, every game he's on the field, he's going to put up fantasy points, but I do think that he's now in a very, very elite tier. So you're betting on him to return high-end numbers when you select him here. That would be my one concern, even though I've said on the record, I think Chicago is an offense that's going to take a massive step forward, and they certainly added a real, number one target in DJ Moore for him. So the one argument could be the fact that they put a lot into improving the weapons around Fields. Maybe they take a little bit of the pressure off him, and that might lead to slightly less rushing and slightly less work inside the red zone as a rusher. But, he's fine. But I like the Jordan Love one a lot. And I think the draft helped you
Well,
a great deal.
it was taking Rodgers and Love was leveraging uncertainty
The blackjack split, Todd.
on both of them.
Blackjack split.
Yeah, yeah, it was. I'm going to move on. I think we covered that pretty darn good. I will say that most of my fields was when he was in the 4th round, and once the DJ Moore got there, he moved back up into the 3rd. But I'm going to throw a couple fields numbers back at you. I took out the 5 game. You know how after 5 games they let him loose,
Yeah.
right? In those games after that, he hit usable weeks, which is a top 12 week for a quarterback, less 1 point, 90% of his games, and he averaged 9.3 points per game above usable. Just to put that in context, Patrick Mahomes had 9.3, and Jalen Hurts had 9.1, and Josh Allen had 8.9. So I know that he might not run quite as much, and he had some super big plays. But like you said, there's a pretty good floor there. To me, that was another way to leverage the top 3 guys going in the early to mid 2nd round in early best ball.
Yeah, I like that. I like that call a lot. And I do think that you bring up the top 3, like Burrow has gotten dragged up almost into a top 4. So
it's hard for me to take him there.
I agree with you. And we've had this conversation before about how like Burrow, it's difficult to see Burrow kind of beating his ADP. But Fields, I think it's in the outcomes.
Because you don't have the rushing.
You don't have the rushing.
I would rather take a shot on Herbert at his ADP because he kind of profiles very similar to Burrow, but you get him two rounds later.
Yeah. If you want to look at it like that, it's like Herbert's the arbitrage play to Burrow. Fields would be
on
the arbitrage play
quarterbacks, yeah.
And Fields would be your Hurts arbitrage. So
yeah, and that's a great way to put it that I hadn't thought of. Let's move on to a couple things because we got about 12 minutes left.
Sure.
Let's talk about some. We want to hit the rookies because we just had the draft. I think I did mention next week we're going to have both Ryan McChrystal from Sharp Football Analysis and Shane Hallam on to deep dive the rookies.
Awesome.
And they're both phenomenal at that. And we also want to give ADP a chance to settle before we do our rookie, because this is a best ball podcast. This isn't a hot take, how much we like the draft podcast. So we always want to tie things to ADP because we might love a player, but hate the ADP. And that means for the time being, you hate the player. But what were some of your favorite and least favorite landing spots for rookies?
My least favorite was easily Zach Charbonnet. That was a guy that I had been drafting in some best ball leagues. I was really, if you told me he was drafted in this range of the draft, I would feel extremely smart about what I did. But now he goes to a crowded backfield. I do think like the Seattle's going to have a good offense. And could Zach Charbonnet be the goal line back? Could Zach Charbonnet be the 2-minute back? There's some outs here, but at the end of the day, Ken Walker is the proven player, and Zach Charbonnet is the new player. So he's going to have to beat
prospect.
Out. Yeah,
right. Well, like if they both came out this year, Walker would have been. If Walker came out this year, he would have been either the second or third back off the
third
board.
Back. I think at the end of the day, he would have been the third back selected.
Yeah, you're
but
right, because Gibbs.
But again, like I agree with you. But NFL teams are different where me, you, and then 5 other fantasy guys that we really respect might completely agree on that take. But we are not the Seattle Seahawks, and they spent similar draft capital. So Ken Walker, they see Ken Walker every single day. Do they have any sort of concerns long-term with him? They certainly show that with their actions that they value having a second running back, because I do not buy the notion that there's a argument going that Seattle devalues second round picks more than other organizations, and They had a need for a second running back, so they wanted to use the pick to get one they loved in Charbonnet. But at the end of the day, if you're just going for a backup, you can wait till the 4th round. I mean, this is the same organization that got Chris Carson in like the 7th round. So I don't know. I don't like it at all. The Zach Charbonnet landing spot makes me sick on many levels.
I'll throw this out before you give us the one that you like. I will say that I didn't draft a lot of Ken Walker in the 2nd round because I thought this could happen.
Yeah.
Right? Because they showed it last year. How do you they had Penny, and they also had a ton of injuries at running back the last 3 years. I think this is more of a hedge on injury than it is anything against Walker. But at the same time, Charbonnet is going to cut into Walker more than some 4th or 5th round guy. So I agree with you. It's pretty bad. So who's your favorite landing spot or two?
I touched on Jordan Addison. I love that landing spot. And for best ball, I also love Dalton Kincaid's landing spot. Like Dalton Kincaid is a guy that I've been taking in best ball drafts for a while now. This is a guy that we have my guys at Player Profiler, guys that you kind of, flag plan on. And he's been a guy that I've flag planted on for a while. I think he is a natural receiver. I think he can win at many levels. I think you can line him up in the slot. I think you can play him outside. It's just such an exciting addition to Buffalo. We've been really wanting Buffalo to have a secondary target. And I think in 8 months, when we have some data, Dalton Kincaid's going to be that guy that's just the clear second fiddle to Diggs in the target tree. Like I get Gabe Davis, and Gabe Davis played injured last year. There's that argument is out there. But at the end of the day, they traded up to get Dalton Kincaid. They did not make a move to trade up and get one of these wide receivers. They went and got the move tight end. I think this is a player that's going to help Josh Allen, and I think he's really going to help our best ball teams. And if you build your team correctly, you can deal with the weeks where maybe Dalton Kincaid doesn't give you a big number, because it's the spike weeks that I think he's going to provide that are going to really, really move the needle in best ball.
That's a very interesting take. I have been taking Isaiah Likely and Jelani Woods, 2 second-year guys with a ton of talent. I do like Kincaid, the player. I don't know if I agree on all your takeaways there, and I'm starting to see him 13th, 14th round. And just my history is, and I do like Kincaid. I liked his tape. But rookie tight ends, I would, if you fade them once they get up around the 12th, 13th round, you're going to win more years than you lose. And I do think they like Shakir in the slot. So I think your take is definitely possible, something I'm going to consider. And that's my thought. I definitely want to cover a couple of the biggest things with veterans. And the biggest one, Theo, for fantasy purposes, was the DeAndre Swift trade. How do you see that backfield working out? And I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you, give me the earliest round you'd be willing to draft each one of these 3 guys in best ball drafts.
So I actually had this conversation for redraft yesterday where I would be comfortable taking DeAndre Swift in the 5th round. And I think that would probably apply for best ball as well. In best ball, I'm actually less concerned about Swift than I would in redraft, because I do think he's going to give us very big spike weeks. Yeah. And I think he's insulated where he's going to have weeks where his floor is going to be a very safe one to bet on. Whereas I think Penny, who's obviously going to go later than Swift now, I think Penny is going to have way more variance in his weekly scoring. I think Penny could have like a big week, and then he could have a week where he's, giving you a 5-6 pointer. But I think Swift, it's very difficult for us to look at what Philadelphia has done in the past and how they use running backs under Nick Sirianni, where they haven't targeted the running back position at all, but they haven't had a guy who's had this much pass catching success. And one person said, well, Theo, you're wrong. Miles Sanders was a 50 catch guy and they had him on the roster, but not under Sirianni. It was under Reich.
Right.
So like Swift, you go out and get him. And we look at Swift for what he's done as a professional. He's averaged 5 targets a game. So even if that takes a hit, he's still at like probably 4+ targets a game. Like even if it takes a 20% hit on his career. So I like Swift a lot. If he steams up too high, Todd, I'm probably out. But if I can get him in the 5th, I'm okay with it. I think he's the kind of back that beats in the dead zone. And then for Penny, I think Penny's going to be somewhat attractive now because if you build your team correctly, then you can put up with the low scoring weeks, because I think those big spike weeks are going to help you. And DeAndre Swift has missed games every year. So DeAndre Swift has played, he's never missed. So I think the misconception is DeAndre Swift is some guy that's missed like a whole season. He's never played less than 13 games in a year, but that's still there. So with Penny, where is his current ADP, Todd, before the Swift?
He was like 8th, 9th round.
So I think that there's going to be a correction where he moves down to, I'm going to guess he's going to become an 11th, 12th rounder because of the quality of the offense.
Not seeing it so far.
Not yet.
No, and that's disconcerting to me. So for me, Swift is a 6th round guy, but I'm a cheap MFer.
Yeah.
So if I notice that he never makes it, I will bite the bullet and take some in the 5th. I don't think I would be too interested in the 4th because they haven't given any wide receiver, any running back, a huge workload.
Yeah.
And, I'm okay with Penny where you said, but in single digits, I'm going to struggle. And Gainwell is a guy that I've seen slipping 15th, 16th, 17th round now. And I am absolutely willing to take some shots on Gainwell that late.
I was actually going to say, like, I was going to bring up Gainwell because Gainwell's probably the big best ball winner here, because if he slides down into that range, I think that one thing that's important, and it's one thing that you and Justin Herzig and a lot of people I really respect for best ball always bring up, is those last few rounds, especially in like an underdog type setting or an FFPC slim. A lot of people treat those as like swing for the fences type picks. Whereas a guy like Gainwell is really the kind of guy that's going to help you, because he's going to have those floor weeks mixed in with a few nice, spike weeks, where he's the kind of guy that's going to really help you move through, where some people might be chasing a 3rd string, 2nd string running back that has no path. We know that Gainwell is a Sirianni guy. There's going to be Gainwell weeks, no matter how this backfield shakes out.
And you've got Sirianni's 2 injury-prone guys in front of him. So I'm going to sum up for you my whole theory on drafting in one sentence. I look for talented guys who have a floor where they're being drafted. Now, what do you need out of that 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th round? You're really looking for 3 or 4 usable weeks, right? But with an injury, they will get more volume than you expect, right? So I'm always, and not every pick I make, I use this, but in general, my theory is find talented players with a good floor and then find a scenario where they can get you a ceiling. Because every year we see it, Theo, injury, ineffectiveness, weird coaching. There's all different scenarios where guys who we didn't think would get volume get it. But do they have the talent to take advantage of it when they get it? And what is it going to cost you if you don't get it? Are they still going to be, make your squad, give your squad a chance to advance? That's my theory.
No, I like that a lot. I like that a great deal. And I think that's a very sharp thing to say. And I think that if there's any takeaway from this pod, it's, what Todd just said with the ways to treat the back end of your draft. It's very important. I think the better best ball players really just do a better job of drafting from like rounds 15 through 20. Those are the kind of rounds that can really, really help you. And I think a lot of people, they treat them as somewhat throwaway rounds or swing for the fences rounds.
All right, let's hit 2 last things. We're both very loquacious, and I do want to get these, especially the first one, because I disagreed with you on this one. And it's funny because we both love the player. But I saw you say that you thought that Roschon Johnson was going to take over that backfield some point in the mid part of the season. I've just seen too many times the rookie without the high draft capital not even get the chance to do that in year one. And both Khalil Herbert and Dante Foreman aren't scrubs, right? If they were scrubs, I would say, yeah, the fourth round guy's so good. Those guys aren't. But I think, Roshan, well, first of all, he's dropping. So I do think he's worth taking where I'm seeing him again, 16th, 17th, 18th round, where I was kind of taking him almost every draft, pre-draft. But tell me why you think that Roshan Johnson is going to take over, because I want to believe, because I've got like 35% early best ball.
Well, I think it's interesting because the certain teams are devaluing the running back position in the draft capital they spend on them. We've seen back-to-back seasons of fourth round picks hitting. Michael Carter 2 seasons ago gave you, I don't have the stats in front of me, but I'm guessing he gave me 5 or 6, top 20 weeks. Like he had one, I know he had 1 week where he was the RB1 overall, and he had several other weeks where he was very helpful. That was not for an entire season, of course. Then last year you saw Dameon Pierce, similar to Roshan Johnson in multiple ways, where they were strong runners from big schools, had some weight on them, and he ends up in the 4th round and not on day 2. Some people brush that aside. He ends up in Houston and he runs for, close to 1,000 yards. And he was, very good on point per game basis. Then you have this year where Roshan Johnson, I thought would go on day 2. So maybe I have a little bit of bias here, but I was
praying, but I've been disappointed too many times, Theo, where the teams just don't see what we see.
But again, it's a 4th round pick. It's not a 7th round.
It's not bad.
And I think that the 4th round is interesting because you have you basically have the night the draft ends, and then that time period before where you have a plan. And Chicago went and took Roshan Johnson. He was the first running back selected in the 4th round. So he was the 4th running back selected on day 3. And he's a guy where we reference Herbert, we reference Foreman. I like Foreman a lot. Foreman last year, Foreman was a guy that I took a couple shots on in Dynasty because I don't necessarily believe in Khalil Herbert. I think Khalil Herbert has shown flashes of talent, but again, you're talking about a 6th round player. He's like 26 years old. He was a 6th round pick, and he's never done it for a course of a season. He's done it in pockets. And now Khalil Herbert has moved up into, mid RB3 land. So you're already taking him with a little bit of risk. Deonta Foreman, we like Deonta Foreman a lot, but Deonta Foreman has played on multiple teams, and he's 28. And last year he ran for 900 plus yards in Carolina, but everything went well for him in terms of the offense completely changed, and they went to this crazy run-heavy approach, and he played very well. But again, you're talking about a guy on multiple teams and a 6th round pick, now competing with Roshan Johnson, a 6'1", 220-pound back. He was a former quarterback. The guy, there's just a lot to his game that I like. I think he's a very good runner. And I think that the Chicago offense is going to be different this year. I think everything they've showed us.
You convinced me a little bit on this one.
18th round.
I got to cut you off because I want to get this last question in.
Sure.
And I don't want to go over. We're already kind of at the end of the range.
Cool. Go for
it. That's the one you kind of convinced me on the most.
Okay, good. I got another Roshan lover in the 18th round. There you go.
Well, I mean, I had 35. I mean, I don't normally have 35% of anyone. I had 35% of him pre-draft. And if he hadn't moved up to the 12th, 13th round, I might have 50%. I love the player.
I don't think that hurts you, Todd. I think the 35% Roshan, you're going to be pleased you did it.
I'm hoping. I've also got 37% Tajay Spears, who hit a kind of the nut spot.
Yeah.
And I've got like 20-something% of A-Chain, and we both know that that's going to probably look good. But the question is, Bryce Young, C.J. Stroud, and Anthony Richardson, who are you most excited to draft at the ADP you expect them to be at? And do you feel the same way about the receivers? And especially interested in your take on Jonathan Mingo, a guy that, we've seen this before, guys who come out of nowhere. They really don't have the tape to back it up, but now is a second round pick. Your thoughts on the three QBs, the receivers there, especially Mr. Mingo?
I think we're going to have more clarity on the wide receiver situation in Carolina as the summer moves along. Utah, I think that there'll be a pecking order, and I think that it'll be important to see how they view Mingo at first. But we certainly Mingo is a 4.4 guy. He's 220. He had a huge vertical leap, and he started producing his his last season at Ole Miss. The year before, he had a foot injury, so the stats look low, but he was injured. I think it's interesting. Mingo is certainly not the safest wide receiver of those second round selections, but he does have a high upside based on his athleticism and the guys around him, like Thielen, Shark, Marshall, and then the guy that they spent a top 40 pick on. So he's interesting. I don't know if I would want a ton of him this year because I think that there's some risk there. And I'm not as interested in Bryce Young as I would be CJ Stroud, because I think CJ Stroud has a little bit of untapped rushing potential that we did not see at Ohio State that I think could be used in Houston. I mean, obviously the guy for fantasy is Anthony Richardson. I mean, I think that if one of the easiest things to do, if you really want and you want to plan your best ball teams out like this, I hate having two quarterbacks from the same team, but a Gardner Minshew, Anthony Richardson build is absolutely doable. And you'll get probably 4 to 6 starts out of Minshew before Richardson takes over. And then
I don't think so. I'm drafting Richardson like he's starting day one. And if I have 15% Richardson and I'm wrong, well, my leverage is the other 85% of the teams that I don't have. I think I just, Theo, I'm throwing my chips in as long as his ADP stays reasonable. I think he's a day one starter.
So I might disagree with you on that, but I do think that the way you build your teams, you're going to be fine because you're going to have an established quarterback that'll get you through for a couple weeks until he starts. I just think it's a tall ask to throw a guy that's not even 21 years old out there for day one in the NFL. I think that they want him to succeed, and I think they're okay with Minshew for a few games. But again, I'm with you. Anthony Richardson, even if he's a bad NFL quarterback, is going to be a good fantasy quarterback. He's such a dynamic runner, and he's so big and strong, and he's got a deceptive deep ball on a team where he's got Michael Pittman, he's got Alec Pierce, and now he's got Josh Downs underneath. And you bring up Jelani Woods. They have interesting guys on the offense, and they also have Jonathan Taylor. Will keep defenses honest. So you think about the success that Lamar Jackson had next to Mark Ingram, where they both carried each other up in fantasy in that 2019 season where they both crushed their ADP and it was side by side. I mean, it's hard for Taylor to really crush his ADP, but you could see Taylor have a very good season and Anthony Richardson have a good fantasy season right next to one another.
Yeah. And they also took
Josh Downs.
And I love that landing spot for Downs. I mean,
and Evan Hull is an interesting 20th round type guy now in best ball too, Todd, because Evan Hull is, I think, going to be he's going to win the backup job. I think he'll be the handcuff to Taylor, and Hull has a ridiculous athletic profile and he can catch passes. So he's an interesting guy.
They had a great draft. I was more looking. They took Blake Freeland. Their offensive line let them down last year.
Yeah,
and they spent a fourth on one, and I thought they had taken more.
Freeland is an absolute mountain. He's one of the biggest.
They took one in the late. Also, Jake Witt. Yeah, I thought they had done a little more, but I'm like you, Theo. I'm pretty excited about the Colts, not from a football standpoint, but from a fantasy standpoint, because their guys are going to be so cheap.
Yeah, and they're an interesting team to I mean, they're not interesting. They're a very predictable team. I think Michael Pittman is what he is. You know what the target share is going to be. Anthony Richardson, is going to run for a lot of yards, and Jonathan Taylor is going to be an effective running back. Those guys are very, very easy to figure out. And I think Alec Pierce is interesting because that's a guy that is an outside receiver that could end up catching a few more touchdowns than most people think, just based on the quality of the running game. It's going to open things up over the top. I think Pierce could end up being a winner as well.
Well, I wish I could talk to Theo Gremminger from Player Profiler for another hour, but I think we're going to have to go. Theo at the OG Fantasy on Twitter. Follow him if you're not. One of the true grinders, one of the true nice guys in this industry. And I want to thank you very much for coming on and chopping it up with me today.
I always love chopping it up with you. I love doing podcasts with you. And I think after reminiscing about our 4-for-7 advance rate, we got to split a couple teams this summer too, Tod.
Dude, you just let me know when and where. I kind of regretted that I didn't push you last year to do some. And I know you're so busy and you've got so many other guys you do things with. But I really feel like we left something on the field that I just had a real good feeling working with you.
I'm in for sure.
Awesome. All right, that's going to do it for this week. Thank you, producer Eddie, as well. And we will see you next week when we are going to have Shane Hollum of Draft Countdown, as well as Ryan McChrystal from Sharp Football. We're going to do a deeper dive on these rookies. Everyone have a great week.